20 years ago, a politician invited his young cousin, an inspiring Russian general, over to see his new house built in Moscow. When the young cousin arrived, the politician was standing in front of a luxurious mansion and welcomed the guests. His cousin asked him how he managed to afford such a magnificent mansion on the salary he was receiving. The politician smiled and pointed at the bridge into the distance and said, "My dear cousin, listen and learn from me. You see that bridge over there? I was allocated $100 million to build it, so what I did was clever accounting and I managed to get it built for $20 million. That's how I managed to get my magnificent mansion." The cousin was thoroughly impressed and took this lesson to heart. 20 years later, the same politician received an invitation from the same cousin, who is now a military general. Upon arrival, the politician was astonished to see the cousin standing in front of a luxurious yacht. The politician gasped and said, "My dear Lord Cousin, how did you manage to afford this on your salary as a general? This luxury yacht must have been worth $100 million. The general smiled and said, "You see our Russian Air Force dominating the skies in Ukraine?" The politician responded, "What Russian Air Force?" Corruption in the military can cause all of these things to happen. It throws off the efficient allocation of resources, confuses the incentives of the military higher-ups, and sees money and goods siphoned off to purchase private luxury yachts worth hundreds of millions of dollars rather than buying equipment that is needed to win a war. And lucky for Ukraine, there are a few countries in the world more corrupt than Russia. The country's political system and the economy are rife with corruption, and the problem consistently stifles innovation, wastes resources, disrupts the flow of information, and sees untalented people rise through the ranks whilst viable candidates get left behind. However big a military is, if it's directed by a country dealing with so much corruption, then it is impossible to stop it from seeping in. Here we're going to look at the ways that corruption in the Russian military has turned the invasion of Ukraine from an easy task into a grinding ordeal. The effect of the corruption first became obvious just a few days after the invasion was launched. Despite appearing to have a good thought-out plan, the Russian army was quickly hit with logistical issues, meaning equipment and troops were stuck on their way to their destinations. Now, it would normally be fair to assume that a country the size of Russia, with so much time to draw a plan and so much access to fuel, wouldn't have a problem with getting its military equipment to Ukraine, especially since it was a literal land invasion of a neighbor sharing the same borders. But, lucky for Ukraine, Putin didn't account for the extent of corruption and how much money of military expenditure that was already stolen. What many of the smarter corrupt generals realized early on was that if they were given a budget with which to procure equipment, there was no need to spend it all on purchasing the best available product. Instead, what often happened is that the cheapest alternatives available were sought out so that the extra money could be pocketed. This became most obvious when the tires of equipment transfer vehicles rapidly broke down at the beginning of the invasion, holding up supply lines and preventing frontline troops from advancing at the speed which was planned. Who would have guessed a truck becomes utterly useless if you buy unreliable but cheap made-in-China tires to drive it around? If the vehicles were equipped with tires and parts of the expected quality, then there would have been far less disruption to the Russian army's initial advance. Instead, much of the equipment was chosen just because it was the cheapest thing available on the market, often coming from China or other parts of Southeast Asia. That extra money saved by going for a cheaper product couldn't even be invested elsewhere in the military because high-ranking military officers would much rather keep the change themselves. I mean, heck, I too would love myself a private luxury boat to impress babes in skin-tight bikinis while partying and listening to Russian disco music in the background. But why are members of the Russian military so happy to make these corrupt choices? There are a number of reasons that this seems to come so naturally to those higher up in Russia's chain of command. The first of these is the absolute dire living standards that many people in the Russian military have. It has been reported before that the standards in Russian prisons are higher than in the Russian army. Yes, you heard that right. Life is better to be a convicted criminal locked up in a Russian jail than to be a soldier fighting for the defense of the motherland. Now, in times of extremity, this may be temporarily feasible, but to expect the people who are sacrificing their lives for their country to be okay with this long term is absolutely absurd. The conditions for soldiers in the Russian military haven't just been grim since the invasion of Ukraine began, but have been notoriously awful for a really long time. Like in years and years of this. This alone can encourage people to seek out different means of improving their lot. Destitution is one thing that can drive people to corruption, but it becomes even more likely when those in poverty can see the unearned wealth of others around them. And it's not like the super and corrupt in Russia try to hide their ill-gotten wealth. In fact, it's the exact opposite. For many members of the Kremlin regime, it's as if they were hot girls on Instagram, trying to outdo the next girl by showing off skimpier butt pics. But instead of showing their rear ends, they are doing this with photos of huge private mansions, luxurious super yachts, and ridiculous jewels have become the norm. Even the dumbest Russian farmer from Siberia can figure out that the price of a private super yacht costs more than what a military general's salary can afford in more than a lifetime. It is clear to all Russian people that these politicians and oligarchs didn't put in any labor for this wealth that they show off, but instead came into it by scheming and taking corrupt routes. So, for those living in tough situations, not only do they see that there are others living a glamorous life, but they are also encouraged to believe that corruption is a legitimate way of achieving it. It is essentially an example set by the Kremlin to deceive and cheat in whatever way possible so that you can get a bigger house or a larger paycheck. Of course, in a culture of corruption like this, there becomes an open overlap between the political circles and the hierarchy of the military. Unlike the West, it is not a hidden game where both sides pretend that the other is well behaved. Instead, military leaders know they need to satisfy Putin in the right ways to maintain their corrupt connections. In the short term, this may be enjoyable for Putin as he hears yes when he wants to and is generally told that he's doing the right thing. That's not a helpful culture to have around you in a time of war, though. Planning a full-scale invasion requires a myriad of options and thought and honest analysis if you want to get it right. This is true whether invading Ukraine or invading anywhere else. At the end of the day, wars are exceedingly complicated things, and military experts are useful because they can say truths that may not be obvious to non-experts. But when those in charge of the military are just keen to keep Putin happy so they can maintain their corruption, they don't end up telling him the truth that he should be hearing. Instead, he's consistently told that he is doing the right thing and that his decisions are paying off, even if they are going disastrously. In the long term, it is a far from sustainable way to plan and sustain an invasion. What it inevitably leads to is confused leadership and endless misinformation being passed around. Ukraine is very lucky that many of Russia's military leaders are focused on keeping their corrupt boss happy rather than winning the war. But corruption started affecting the Russian military long before the invasion actually started. Moscow was at a disadvantage from the very beginning because of the lack of innovation in the years prior and the mishandling of military contracts, both of which can be attributed to the corruption epidemic in the Russian military. The corrupt mishandling of Russian military contracts has made for some hilarious gaffes over the years. Take, for example, one case in 2016 when the Kremlin paid $26 million to a Russian arms company to come up with an aircraft system that would intercept non-strategic missiles. Local reporters said that the deal had been made, and many in the military waited for an innovative product to arrive. However, as the years ticked on, nothing ever arrived, and it became clear over time that the company, which had the contract, had been setting up shell companies. When these were looked into, it was found that some of the shell companies were registered to the addresses of public toilets in southwestern Russia. No aircraft system ever arrived, but $26 million had been taken from the military budget. Over the years, as money slipped out of the military, the Kremlin started getting less and less for its money. This is why they can march around with a huge military on paper, but be so ineffective with it. There's no point in spending huge amounts of money if most of it is just getting siphoned off through shell companies and false promises. Stories like this prevent real innovative arms companies from getting involved with Russia. The last thing that a well-run company wants to get involved with is a corrupt political system, as this This can mean extra expenses, a poor global image, and no long-term future. Therefore, the vast majority of businesses that could potentially innovate in the military sector stay away from Russia. This plays a key role in Russia's army failing to keep up with other countries. In other nations that foster a healthy business culture that is relatively free from corruption, the military industry, just as in any other industry, can thrive. This means weapons can be produced at a more efficient rate and new ideas can be tested out more often. The shocking lack of innovation in the Russian military-industrial complex is why the army has barely progressed since the fall of the Soviet Union. Whilst 30 years ago it was deemed one of the most powerful fighting forces in the world, it now finds itself embarrassed by its smaller neighbors. Corruption might mean that a few people get rich in the short term, but it's no way of sustaining a healthy industry in the long term, including the armaments industry. The clear route for stamping corruption out in Russia would be for Putin to increase how harshly those found guilty are punished. But how can he realistically be expected to do that when he and his circle are so openly corrupt too? The only way Putin and his gang can sustain their lifestyle is through a culture of corruption, and so they are stuck between choosing to actually fight corruption and have to give up a chunk of their wealth, or let the corruption continue and live opulent lives at home. If Putin was going to do the patriotic thing and start tackling corruption in his country, then he would have needed to start a long time before the invasion for it to start having a positive effect in time. By invading long before any serious anti-corruption moves were made, Putin has dug either his own grave or its military's. By some estimates, Putin is the richest person in the world, having siphoned off a huge chunk of Russian wealth into his personal assets. Of course, this is far from being verified, as there is nothing open about the related finances. Judging on his history, though, it seems very unlikely that Putin will start an anti-corruption drive anytime soon, and risk upsetting his own position of wealth and power. So for now, he has to watch on as the culture of corruption he's enabled disables his military and makes the Russian army look like a parody of what it's meant to be. If the Kremlin had the option to rewind several years, then there could have been lots of faults prevented, better wages for those in the army, so it's easier for them to resist corruption, harsher punishments for scandalous military contracts so that innovation could be fostered and the military budget well spent. The problem with steps like these is that they indicate corruption is wrong, which of course it is. But how can we expect Putin to admit that when he is possibly the most corrupt man in the world? Whilst Ukraine is very unlucky to have a neighboring country run by a maniac, it is some of that maniac's faults which mean the invading army is so much weaker than it should be.